Long-term organizations have unique attributes and characteristics that make them more resilient with time and are thus able to survive cyclical downturns and crises, both internal and external. The following are some of the key dimensions essential to this type of organization. The world is becoming multicultural, and we need to understand cultural change. My home state of California has no racial majority. All groups are minorities. Since the 1980s, the societies of Latin America have been profoundly reshaped by the forces of neoliberalism, globalization, and redemocratization. In the process, people who have long been politically marginalized, indigenous groups, women, peasants, gays, Asians, and blacks, are now players in the cultures of Latin America. Organizations must recognize that the employees, consumers, and partners will be increasingly multi-ethnic, multicolored, multinational, and various social classes and political beliefs. More than half of Argentina and Uruguay's people are of Italian descent, though they speak Spanish, not Italian. Sao Paulo in Brazil has more Italians than Rome. Haiti has a higher percent of Africans than many African countries. African ancestry is widespread in the United States, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Brazil, and Colombia. Florida has more people from the Caribbean than some island nations. Native peoples are the majority in Ecuador, Colombia, Guatemala, Panama, Peru, and many others. Mexico is a blend of Spanish and Amerindian people. In short, the Western Hemisphere is an ethnic medley. Any organization that does not recognize, accept, and embrace this great ethnic diversity is in peril. The other change that is imperative to understand is the rapid change across generations. The exponential rate of change has produced at least 5 current generations that share little in common, attitudinally, technologically, politically, economically, recreationally, or occupationally. People and organizations need to be aware of the attitudinal and cultural differences among these generations. Who are these generations? Dubbed the greatest generation by Tom Brokaw, this generation born before 1930 is also called the Depression generation, the World War II generation, or the New Deal generation. As the youngest members of this generation are about to turn 80, only a few of the greatest generation remain in the workforce, though they are still consumers, especially the women of this generation. They are the repository of history and many of our best and most talented ideas, crafts, and practices, some of which could die with them. They are the living generation that watches the most television. As workers, they were associated with stable, long-term organizations. They stuck with their church, their party, their union, and their company. They joined informal organizations in record numbers and created a civic culture and community organization like no subsequent generation. Next in age is what we sometimes call the lost generation, the baby bust generation, or the silent generation. These people were born between 1930 and 1945. They are a small generation because family sizes were smaller during the U.S. Depression and World War II. They tend to be conservative, although they have produced rebels like James Dean, John Kerouac, and Lenny Bruce. They are hardworking, traditional, and more formal. This group is retiring in droves, and some of their work ethic is retiring with them. Like the greatest generation, the silent generation generally has had predictable career paths, worked hard for 1 or 2 companies, and moved up the organizational ladder. These workers may work longer than any prior generation. They are loyal workers, though they are considered risk-averse and conformist. Many sure to value such employees for what they know, not just what they do. The largest and perhaps the most famous generation in history are the baby boomers. Born between 1946 and 1964, change has always accompanied this generation. This generation came to maturity at the same time as the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the sexual revolution, the anti-war movement, and the women's movement. They have been labeled the most radical, the most hedonistic, the most change-oriented, and the most unconventional. They were the first generation for which lifestyle, psychological health, instant gratification, and equality were important values. Not surprisingly, there was a huge generation gap between the boomers and their parents. Never before had an American generation so criticized and disregarded the values of the previous generation. Boomers are in charge of most organizations today, and their values have entered the mainstream of world culture. Their values of openness, self-expression, sexuality, equality, diversity, and change have been conventional cultural values. Boomers grew up at a time of economic prosperity. They like to win, be in charge, and make an impact. Organizations should be aware of some other characteristics of the boomers. This generation is the most ambivalent ever about retirement. Lots of boomers are psychologically tied to their profession, may want to start a second or third career, and experience anxiety over the financial future and their pension benefits. According to a survey by the National Institute on Aging, nearly 3/4 of boomer workers would prefer gradual retirement. They crave time for leisure activities and family, and look for part-time, job sharing, flex time, and other flexible opportunities. Boomers are change-oriented, and they are trying hard to stay up to speed, not always successfully, especially in the area of technology. Born between 1965 and 1980, the members of Generation X are often described as street-savvy survivors who have had to deal with drugs, AIDS, and the disintegration of the family in many countries. They are described as fiercely independent, self-directed, resourceful, and skeptical of authority and institutions in general. Although they may be committed, blind company loyalty is abhorrent to this group. They seek an exciting and challenging environment. Since they grew up without much supervision, they require little supervision and may resent management control. Employers need to recognize that Generation Xers value autonomy most and should consider flex time, job sharing, telecommuting, sabbaticals, and independent contracts. According to Bennett and Rademacher, Generation Xers have a low level of political activism, contrary to the boomers, where college campuses were the center of their protests. Their book argues Generation Xers' uncertainty of its economic future has affected its view of politics also. Xers are less likely to align themselves with a certain political party. Rather, they vote for a candidate based on issues. Like most youth, they distrust previous generations and harbor no strong loyalties toward Democrats, Republicans, or independents. Generation X is least likely to read a newspaper, watch TV news, or listen to news on the radio. Surveys show that only 25% read a newspaper, about 38% watch the news, and about 48% listen to radio news. In discussing change, it is perhaps most useful to discuss the current generation, variously called Generation Y, Echo Boomers, Millennials, and Generation Me. They are different than prior generations, yet They will constitute the consumers and the employees of the future, and of course, the students and entry-level employees of today. What do we know about these millennials, these people that were born between 1980 and 1995? They are self-oriented. As Robert Putnam illustrated in his book, Bowling Alone, civic involvement is continuing to decline. Young people today are less likely to belong to formal service organizations, community organizations, or political organizations. But they are more likely to volunteer for causes in which they believed. They are the entitled generation. As my colleague Jean Twenge here at San Diego State has demonstrated in her book, Generation Me, today's youngest generation were anointed by their parents as the chosen ones. They were all told they were special by their baby boomer parents, and they believed it. Schools changed from criticism of students and their work to rewarding every student for even small accomplishments. In my high school, my daughter had an entire wall of awards and plaques. Generation Me was told they could be whatever they wanted to be, however far-fetched it was, to become an NBA player, president of a Fortune 5 company, or a Hollywood star. They think that they deserve it all: money, career, family, love, fun, and a rich personal life. The bright side is their self-determination. As a result of their individuality, entitlement, and aspirations, they are perhaps the best organized and self-disciplined generation around. In many respects, they are good employees, organized, motivated, and career-oriented. However, few are willing to give up their lifestyle to put in the long hours or multiple jobs of previous generation. Little generation gap. Unlike baby boomers and Generation X, who were scorned and even disrespected the values and beliefs of their parents, this generation gets along well with their parents. No battle scars. Although millennials have had challenges such as drug abuse, AIDS, the 9/11 attacks, and the challenges of technological change, they have not suffered the major traumas of previous generation: world wars, depression, civil conflicts, crushing racial and gender discrimination, and the military draft. They may respond very well, but they are untested in hard times. Throughout the world, millennials are less likely to believe their country is better than any other. Putting aside nationalism that has characterized prior generations and has made people in almost every country believe they are a superior culture and anointed as the special or chosen people. Increasingly, millennials are simply citizens of the world and believers in globalization. According to the Pew Global Trust Attitude Survey, in the U.S., 68% of those in ages 65 and older agree with the statement, "Our people are not perfect, but our culture is superior," while only 49% of those ages 18 to 29 agree. The generation gap in Western Europe and America is similar. More than half of older Western Europeans are culturally chauvinistic, compared with only 1 in 3, 32%, of their younger counterparts. The difference between generations is particularly apparent in France, where only 21% of those under 30 support the notion of cultural superiority, while 50% of those age 65 and older say French culture is superior. While racism is far from dead, millennials are the least racially oriented and racist of any generation. It is not surprising that Barack Obama's strongest support came from millennials of all races, and his weakest support was from senior citizens of most races. Unlike prior generations, virtually all my students have dated interracially, a trend supported by surveys. Now, what tools are needed in coping with change as we move into this new millennium? Vision. Though vision has become a cliche, the ability to think creatively about the future should never be underestimated. Organizations need to hire people who are visionary, far-sighted, and can understand current and future trends in technology. Likewise, organizations should reward forward thinking and avoid the annoying admonitions, "That's not the way we do it," or "We have never done it that way." Mission, core competencies. Companies should identify what is central, peripheral, and completely outside their capabilities. Organizations should critically analyze what they are really good at, what they can probably do, and what is outside of their capability. Building on core competencies are a key to a productive forward path. Values. Like people, organizations have central values. What is this organization about? Too often, business organizations are perceived, and may really be, as interested in profits at all costs. The sorry legacy is an industrial wasteland, chemicals, oil refineries, mining operations, the slash and burn mentality. It is what has given many corporations an image of being adverse to the public interest. Most of all, organizations should avoid practices that could cause the demise of the organization. The four horsemen of the apocalypse are management myopia. Many companies that fail focus on short-term profit, burn the furniture, over-leverage, or believe their own hype are most at risk. A long-term vision is essential. Burning human capital. Organizations too often take employees for granted. Human resources are an organization's lifeblood, and employees have different expectations than in the past. They value career path, wellness, lifestyle, skill acquisition, and salary, sometimes unrealistically. Do everything possible to nurture and grow their potentials. Executives should monitor a small but robust set of metrics that reflect what's happening in their business over a range of time horizons. Metrics should include profits and losses, expenses, productivity, employee performance, employee satisfaction, dissatisfaction, customer relations, networks, relationships, and nepotism policies, emotional climate, technology competencies, and phobias. In closing, I have reviewed the key elements of the long-term organization in the third millennium. The cost of failure and starting again is too high today. We all need sustainable education, business, government, and civil society. Let's all collaborate and contribute toward the long-term health and welfare of our shared world. Thank you.